Okay, I'm very excited to be talking to Pauline Paquin, who is a personal finance blogger. She left the corporate world at age 29 to live on her own terms and now is based in Guatemala. Pauline, what came over you to leave the corporate world at 29 and move to Guatemala?
I knew from the start, I went to business school and I knew that corporate world was not for me. It was too strict. It was too complicated, too much politics going on in the office. I wanted out. And the problem obviously was having no money to do so. So I started saving, and very early on, I realized that, every $100 you save is one day of freedom in the future. So it kind of clicked in my head, and I saved more aggressively, tried to make more money. At some point, I had like 5 different little jobs on the side. And eventually it came to enough money to just leave the office and go live life on my own terms.
And so what were your own terms?
My own terms are mostly a lot of freedom and independence. So sometimes you'll find me working at 2 a.m. and you'll find me having breakfast at 5 p.m. or whatever. I don't want to have to do something because it has to be done. So that was the main point. And I also really like mild weather. So I'm based in Guatemala right now, which is called the land of eternal spring. And it's pretty neat.
So do you consider yourself semi-retired, or you're just working somewhere else, but you're working on your own terms?
There are lots of discussions about that. Who's retired, who's not retired. Technically, I can live off my investments, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be happy just, sipping cocktails in a hammock for the next, 60 years. And so I do work on my own projects. I run a little guest house in Guatemala. I have an education project, so I host some volunteers in my village to teach English and computer to the kids for free. And I keep busy with 4 finance blogs that I also own and run. So, life is busy, but it's not an obligation, and that makes things way easier and way nicer.
Okay, so you are a French citizen and you're living outside of France. How do you deal with things like taxes?
My tax situation is very particular because I own some real estate in Guatemala. So the easiest way to go was just to start a Guatemalan LLC and put everything under it. So if my guests get injured, for example, I have the LLC as kind of a screen between me and whatever is going on. And the Guatemalan tax system is pretty favorable. So I pay most of my taxes there, and then I have property in Europe and I pay taxes locally. For US citizens, I've been investigating a little bit, and you have actually, if you spend less than 35 days a year in the US, you can claim an exemption on your income tax. So that's very favorable. And just by doing so, if you're a remote worker or if you're, already paying like $15,000, $20,000 a year in income tax, having that exempted means you can pretty much live abroad for free.
Mm-hmm. But you seem to have to be dealing with taxes, and you don't just walk away from the tax net. You really have to plan for it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, of course. The last thing you want is, try to come back to your country after 10 years abroad and getting a big fine from the IRS because you didn't pay or you omitted something. So you really want to talk to specialists, to tax lawyer who specializes in expat taxes for that. And there is always a way to minimize your tax burden when you live abroad, be it through a company or be it through claims. Say you're going to do business back in the US anyway, so you can claim your flights back home, even though you're going to visit family as well. Stuff like that. So yes, you want to spend the time or hire someone because what you're going to save is huge and it's worth digging into it.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Pauline Paquin, who is a personal finance blogger. She left France and moved to Guatemala, where she continues to work, even though she's done pretty well with her investments and is able to live on them. Do you have certain suggestions for what sort of investments people should look at if they are considering moving abroad?
I really like real estate, but having bought 3 properties so far in Guatemala, I realized that I'm really tied to the country. So at first, I would suggest, just move abroad for 3 months, see how much you like the country, the culture, the people, the food, everything, the climate. And if you project yourself living there 15 years from now, real estate can be really lucrative and really interesting. Aside from that, I'm pretty boring when it comes to investing. I put most of my money in index funds and I do a little bit of peer-to-peer lending. But if you don't know much about investing, I would just go with index funds, S&P 500, the UK FTSE 100, or any index that tracks the market, because it will diversify your portfolio. And by investing a regular sum monthly, you will cost average your investment, and it doesn't get much easier than that.
Mm-hmm. What about the psychology of living overseas? How do you deal with that? In other words, I presume you're far away from your family?
Yes, I am, but I've been living in Guatemala on and off since 2003, and back then it was really complicated. We didn't have much WhatsApp or FaceTime or all the apps that allow you to get in touch, and flights were much more expensive. Now it's about half price to fly back home, and I also make more money. So all in all, I go back to Europe about 2 or 3 times a year, and I really like having a home base in Guatemala in a remote location in the middle of nature, on a beautiful lake. That is something I would never be able to afford in Europe. And so I go back to the city, go back to Paris, or fly over to the States and visit friends. But I'm also aware that my quality of life could not be bought in Europe or the US for that little money.
So it's really the strength of the currency that you work in, which is allowing you to, I presume that the cost of living in Guatemala is not so expensive?
The cost of living is really low. You can, for example, have staff for $300 or $400 a month. So that's a luxury. If you're thinking about retiring abroad, in your 60s or 70s, if you need medical attention, you can get a nurse for $500 that will come full-time to your house. And property is a bit expensive, actually, in Guatemala, but I mean, I'm on a lakefront property that would be worth many, many millions if it were anywhere in Europe. Here, you're looking at a small 6 figures, so it makes a big difference, yes.
I guess interesting issue. A lot of the listeners to my show live in Israel. They're Americans who've emigrated to Israel, and they find that just because it's not quite the same as Guatemala, I guess there really is a similar cost of living here. So when I talk to people in my day job as a financial advisor, the fact is a lot of the financial planning and retirement planning that we do is very, very much the same as if they had stayed in the States. I think one of the things that people tell me a lot is that even in America, you don't have to, in fact, go overseas. You could just go to different states where things are cheaper. Have you spoken to people about that?
Yes, of course. I mean, I could buy a house for the same price in the Midwest and live in the Midwest. Now it all depends on your priorities. So some people want to stay close to family, and moving to the Midwest is not an option because family is on the East Coast or the West Coast. But yes, it can be done. You can live very, very cheaply in the middle states of the United States. But you will still have things that really are still expensive, such as healthcare. You have excellent doctors, for example, in Guatemala, and we get a lot of medical tourism, people coming for hip replacement or dental work. And it's less expensive to do that than to have the job done in the States.
Mm-hmm. And you feel the quality is similar?
Yes. I go to a dentist in Guatemala City who's trained at NYU, and his work is top notch. And you can find a lot of excellent surgeons, specialists that's trained in the US and then came back to set up clinic in Guatemala City.
Mm-hmm. So there certainly are a lot of opportunities. And it sounds to me like also you've planned carefully your finances, your investments, so that you're able to live the life that you want to lead, which I think is so important, regardless of where someone lives or what someone does. Realizing if you're in a job and you especially when you're young and you say, I just don't want to be doing this the rest of my life, good for you, Pauline. Good for you for realizing that and making significant changes that would be that would be able to improve your life. And I know this is something you write about. So in the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people follow you and follow your work?
My main site is richfinancialindependence.com, and that's where I talk about my journey towards financial independence and how I relocated to Guatemala. So if you want to find me, that would be the easiest way to do so. Okay,
we will put a link to that at the show notes at today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Pauline Paquin, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.